joined once again by the encyclopedic, the indomitable, the award-winning, incredibly talented, always informative Whitney Webb. How are you this evening?
Hey Steve, I'm doing good. Thanks for having me back on.
Yeah, absolutely. You've been incredibly busy, as you were saying, and now it looks like
Yeah.
you've got a little bit of a break. This is I have to.
Yeah, well, I'm on vacation technically this week and next week, so if you don't see any articles from me or a lot of social media activity, I'm not dead. I'm on vacation.
That's awesome. And if anybody deserves a break, man, after all the stuff you've had to go through and look at and dig into, man, that's hectic. I'm trying to adjust the settings on the YouTube here for the moment, but we can still chat. Boom. So I again, you did. You did four parts on Epstein, and then the wrap up was kind of the Unit 8200 thing. Do I have that right?
No,
Or was that a
so the,
separate
the
ordeal?
Epstein the Epstein like series was four parts, and the idea of keeping it four parts was just kind of to keep it about being like the Epstein network. Because what I tried to show with that series originally, and I wanted to keep it that way, is that Epstein, was part of a network, that used sexual blackmail operations and did pedophilia and stuff like that, and that he wasn't the first one, and that this has been going on for a long time, and has ties with intelligence going back to even before the CIA existed in the U.S. to like explaining the origins of that and who's a part of that, network going up to Epstein and his connections and things like that. So, what I said in the end of part four, which is the one about the Clintons and all of that, is that there's some spin-offs in the works, and I published one of those. I wrote it in 4 days, or like 3 days or
Oh
something
wow.
insane like that. Yeah. That's about a company, some of his stuff going on with Silicon Valley, stuff that happened really, it all pretty much happened after he left prison the first time when he went to Florida, or was in Florida, well, he wasn't really in prison, he just like, he could leave during the day and then he had to go sleep in prison or something.
Yeah, no, it was at least 16 unfettered hours a day that he had when he was on whatever that work release or whatever it is. But yeah, he had 16 unsupervised hours where he could just roam and do whatever the hell he wanted to do, and it's one of the more troubling aspects about that whole I get just shitstorm is that um, as we know, he was protected on high. He belonged to intelligence, so saith Alexander Acosta. The intelligence that he belonged to looks more and more like it was Mossad. And he was just given carte
Well, I
blanche.
think it was both.
Yeah, there
I
was
think
definite CIA influence in there. And what material and airplanes and all kinds of great stuff that they provided. Um, I don't I don't personally believe that Jeffrey Epstein died in that cell. I believe he was removed. I don't know. I mean that's uh, kind of my take on it. I don't know what your thoughts
right.
are.
Well, a lot of people have thought that based on what's going on, and I think ultimately because of when you throw intelligence in the mix,
Fly
it could really go either way. Did they
where you
extract him
talk.
or did they just take him out? This intelligence link network he was a part of did take people out, even when they worked for them, like Robert Maxwell. Ghislaine Maxwell's father is a good example of that, someone that was offed, but was part of this network. But I think it ultimately comes down to like how important Epstein was to this group, like how high level was he really? We don't really know that. So some people say, oh, he was a low level guy and he was a high level guy. If he was a high level guy, the probability that he was like extracted like that would be a lot higher than if he was just some low-level dude, because it's cheaper just to kill him, right? But if he was really important or had, something, some people said he might have had some, kill man switch or something that would incriminate a lot of people if they actually did kill him or something like that. I mean, we can't, this is all just speculation, right? But I think it ultimately comes down to how important was he to the people he was working for.
Yeah, and I mean, the Zorro Ranch, to my knowledge, has never been raided. I get the way that I put it together in my own head was the agencies that ran him, as it were, needed to get whatever extended compromising material that he had. I mean, I guarantee you the man had properties under shell companies or office buildings under shell companies, and until all of that material became their material, they couldn't afford to have him around in prison talking to anyone, so he was removed and then tied to a chair in a safe house until this can all be collected and processed.
Well, so here's the thing. I think the FBI, or sorry, not the authorities or whatever in New York that raided his penthouse there obtained some of that blackmail and they raided it, and then he went to prison after that. But a bunch of his other residences are like the ranch in New Mexico have never been raided, and the one in the Virgin Islands they decided not to raid until after he died. Or suicided or whatever. So I think, the changing of hands of blackmail is definitely a part of this. I think that's definitely a main factor here. And it's also worth pointing out, too, that, with his death, right, that criminal case where all of this acquired blackmail and all of this potentially incriminating material that was accumulated by federal authorities never has to be made public now, unless someone else is charged. And actually, just a few days ago, there was a judge in Florida that basically ruled that the so-called sweetheart deal that, saw Jeffrey Epstein have that really, cozy, prison sentence in Florida. That judge basically said that non-prosecution agreement can't be thrown out, and that prevents Ghislaine Maxwell from being charged. Who was the most obvious, co-conspirator there. And I guess, I forget exactly who it names, but I don't think it names Leslie Wexner. But no one in media has been, mainstream media has been even, slightly interested in pursuing Leslie Wexner, even though it's, super obvious. And, in my reports, the case is really clear that Wexner is as scummy as they come, dude. It's really absurd.
He must have some insane connections in media, because you never hear a peep about this man. And he's, I mean, you've proven it. There's other people that have picked up the ball since and kind of ran with it. And there's been research about this guy done before. If he is not financially contributing heavily to the betterment of editors at several major news outlets, I would be genuinely surprised.
Well, he's the richest man in Ohio, right? So he has a lot of pull there, and he also has a lot of pull nationally, and also because of the fact that he's a lot of people, especially he's a well-known philanthropist, so all the people that have taken his money are kind of oh, I don't want him to come down, because then that makes us all look, sort of like what happened with MIT and Epstein recently, how they tried to accept that money anonymously, but then it came out that it came from Epstein, and it blew up in their face. I think they're trying to prevent something like that from happening with Wexner too. But I think Wexner was really a lot more high level than he's been. Beyond a billionaire, right? I mean, there's definitely a lot of connections that are really messed up. And what I was told by Catherine Austin Fitz is that an ex-CIA employee had told her that Wexner was one of the main money launderers for organized crime in the United States, used his businesses to do that. We know that in the 90s, he and Epstein brought Southern Air Transport, the Iran-Contra, CIA front company, front airline, to Columbus, Ohio, where Wexner's businesses are, so that they could run cargo for Wexner's company, The Limited, and all these top people in Ohio's government were we think he's working for the CIA, or Wexner and Epstein, are working with the CIA, and they're smuggling stuff for organized crime. And the state's inspector general at the time called the route that the airline, that CIA airline was running for Wexner, the Mayor Lansky run, going back to that, notorious mobster who was really the guy that started or was involved in the genesis of this whole network where Epstein came from.
Yeah, and that's still, I mean, that's one of the craziest things about your whole series to me, is that it's got a foundation in the National Crime Syndicate, and that's the Jewish Mafia and the Italian Mafia, and 100 years later, we're sitting here talking about, Epstein's ties to Mossad, Robert Maxwell's ties to Mossad. There were a couple of different Israeli prime ministers that were involved in this, as well as Saudi arms dealers and Prince Andrew, and it's just, it is a cacophony of just elites doing monstrous shit.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair way to say it. I do want to point out, too, for people that aren't familiar with my series, that the National Crime Syndicate got super influential in both U.S. intelligence and Israeli intelligence. Remember that Israel was founded in 1948, and that there was a lot of influence for people in the U.S., including the Jewish Mafia in that, and including Mayor Lansky, who was really big and very influential in Israel, largely because he funneled an F-ton of weapons there. From the U.S., and so did a lot of other, mobsters during the time, like Bugsy Siegel, Mickey Cohen, a whole bunch of those guys. And then you had billionaires who, like the Bronfmans, who claimed it was philanthropy, and they founded a front organization for smuggling weapons to Zionist paramilitaries. So.
And how does the school Interlaken never get mentioned when we discuss Epstein? How does the what? The camp, the retreat, Interlaken, that's for gifted teens who are in art and theater and music, and it's in Michigan, like kind of in the woods, and it's super high end. Jeffrey Epstein was a donor there, and he had his own cabin adjacent to the dormitory where his scholarship students, the poor kids that were good, and nobody ever fucking talks about that. Like, okay, and it trips me out because when I was in high school, like, my parents were trying to pressure me to apply for a scholarship to go to Interlaken. Not that I would have got Epstein, but it's possible that, like, I would have been there, had some shit going, and I can't even wrap my head around, like, trying to tell a trusted adult about that as a 15-year-old kid.
Well, right. I mean, I think that's why Epstein and the people that work with him consistently look for, like working class girls that had domestic problems and basically had no one to stand up for them, in like troubled home lives or troubled financial situations, things like that. They specifically sought out those types of girls for a reason. And I think it's really sick that, it was done that way, but it often gets ignored. And sometimes, you see like a lot of even like mainstream outlets, for example, be like underage women and things like that, talking about, these girls. I mean, they're like preteens. I wouldn't really call them women. So, like the language they use is like really, a lot of times with mainstream coverage of all this is really troubling, or they focus on like, a microcosm of the bigger, just one small piece of the bigger situation, instead of, focusing on the big picture. I can understand, I guess, why they don't want to talk about the big picture all the time, because, like, in mainstream media, it might cost them their job.
Well, what's insane is that Christine Pelosi, who, of course, is Nancy Pelosi's daughter, like, put a tweet out right after Epstein got arrested. And it was like, okay, people, we're gonna have to, like, come to terms with, as this investigation plays out. And it said, quote, some of our faves might be caught up in this.
I remember that now.
And it's like, you're the Speaker of the House's daughter, like, basically enabling or giving tacit consent to your friends destroying these children. And that's just how it works, I guess, when you're, that high up the level. But it's insane to comprehend that, like, someone could have the character to put out, like, hey, some of our favorite people are probably, brutal child rapists, and we're just, go ahead and pull out your Christmas card list right now, because you might need to cross a name or two off. And it seems to me like everybody knows, but nobody is ever willing to say anything about it until it just reaches a point. And it happened with Harvey Weinstein. It happened with R. Kelly. It happened with, the NXIVM cult, and the Finders, and, it goes on and on. But how could it go on for that long without there just being, blanket knowledge?
I think it's because a lot of these rings or whatever, they're actually connected. Like, a lot of the big pedophile scandals in American history are all connected to the same network. So you start pulling on one enough, and then you start finding all the other people that were involved, and all this dirty laundry starts to air out. Because let's remember too, Epstein was definitely, obviously, involved in pedophilia and in a sexual blackmail operation, but he was also involved in a lot of other criminal activity, like financial crimes, money laundering, all this shadow finance stuff. I mean, he was doing that for intelligence before he even got started doing this, this child sex abuse stuff. So, and he kept doing that throughout that. So, basically what would happen if people were to do an honest investigation of Epstein in the mainstream media is that eventually you would start to pull, not just on the air out and out all these, powerful pedophiles, but you would also out a lot of, like, financial criminals, a lot of drug trafficking, probably a lot of arms trafficking. Epstein in the 80s was super involved in the shadow finance aspect of illegal arms, the illegal arms trade, things like that. So
and you mentioned in your article that you talking about Mina in your article quite a bit, enough for it to remind people, and it never ceases to amaze me that it is so widely known that the CIA trafficked weapons and cocaine through Bill Clinton's home state right before he became president, and no one's like, wait a minute, there's a problem with that, it just rolls, and I don't have that kind of willingness to overlook shit like that in our elected officials. I mean, it's
well, I mean, no one should, but let's remember too that, like, in the early 90s, the media environment was, like, way more controlled even than it is now. I mean, we have social media censorship and things like that, but there wasn't, like, the spread of information was much more contained, and it was pretty easy to sort of memory hole, Mena, Arkansas stuff, since there were several years between that and Clinton's first presidential election, basically. And he was offered as the only alternative to George Bush Sr., who everyone that was fed up with, the Reagan years and all of that were like, well, I guess we're going to vote for Bill Clinton, and he plays saxophone, so it's awesome, and, like, dumb shit like that.
It was supposed to be, that was Jerry Brown's big play, too. That was his big push for being president, was in 1992. California governor. Who basically sold our entire state to Nestle and the Resnick pistachio family, pistachio barons. Are you familiar at all with, like, the pistachio wars thing?
I've heard about it because I know that Yasha Levine, who's just, like, an amazing journalist, he's so awesome. He's been trying to do something about the Resnicks for a while. I followed a lot of his work about from his book Surveillance Valley and a lot of the tech stuff that he's done. But I've heard about their pistachio empire and how they're basically really neocon-y, or neocon-esque.
They're 100% neocon or esque or fully neocon. What they did through a lot of like flat out bribery and lobbying efforts and donations was get a ton of people elected who would put sanctions on Iran and who were trying to destabilize Iran, because Iran was the world's largest producer of pistachios. And basically, because of this family's overwhelming greed to corner the pistachio market, they have helped fund the politicians who then went on to sanction and destabilize Iran, attacking a lot of the infrastructure around the water where they would grow their pistachios, and making it so they couldn't sell their pistachios anywhere. Like, it's fascinating how one family can wield that much influence, and like, we're not at their house with pitchforks.
Right. Well, it would be really crazy if one of the main drivers behind, I don't think this is true, but a driver behind war with Iran would be pistachios. Wouldn't that be nuts? I mean, it's mostly, I think, about oil and, geopolitical rivalries and basically taking out resistance to the U.S.-backed, Israel-Saudi Arabia bloc and all of that.
No,
but,
absolutely.
The pistachios as a side thing, I wasn't really aware of that connection with Iran. But, the U.S. government, CIA overthrew a country for bananas with Guatemala. So, they pretty much any sort of product, they'll overthrow a government.
Coca-Cola hired mercs to go down and slaughter fucking people who were trying to unionize the sugar industry. Go burn houses.
That sounds pretty, honestly, that sounds kind of, outside of the U.S., that sort of like behavior just sounds horrible, but as someone that's lived in Latin America for a really long time, I used to live in the middle of nowhere. I managed a farm in Peru, really way rural, and there were there was a community that opposed the mines, and they got into a fight with the mining company. The village did, and they burned down the workers' barracks. No one died. There was no one inside, but it was an act of protest, I guess. And then the mining company, which was foreign, I think they were Canadian or something, they got the Peruvian military to come in, and they just all the people that had led the protest, they just marched off of cliffs, put bags on their head, and just pushed them off cliffs in the Andes. And that's how it works there. Really, where I live now is it's not like that anymore. But it was in the 80s, thanks to the U.S., who overthrew the government in 1973 and put in the Pinochet dictatorship that lasted until the beginning of the 90s. And they were like that. And pretty much every South American country has had to deal with that sort of stuff, a U.S.-backed dictatorship or U.S.-backed, oligarchy that murders little people.
The Chilean coup where we installed Pinochet was that started on September 11th.
It did. It was the first 9/11.
Yeah.
It was.
Yeah, and people, I saw the last couple of years people have been drawing a little bit more attention to that, and I'm glad that it's getting out there. I don't think that we can move forward at all without some collective acknowledgement of what exactly America is and what it does. And there's people who are trying to wake people up to that, and that's you, and that's our friends at Consortium News, and there's a handful of other people out there that put out really quality work.
Right. Well, these, a lot of these coups historically, that were going on during that time, the 70s and the 80s was really when a lot of them were going on. That was the CIA, right? So let's point out, too, the CIA and just intelligence in general in U.S. and allied companies are the same intelligence agencies connected to people like Epstein involved in this type of, exploiting kids to get more blackmail. They can have more power and control, and they're also the ones overthrowing governments, responsible for our endless wars that installed these dictatorships in Latin America. Remember Iran-Contra, that was all about overthrowing the Sandinistas and putting back the dictatorship that the Sandinistas had overthrown, that was U.S.-backed, the Somoza family, and putting taking the Sandinistas out and putting their guys back in power. And that's pretty much, been something that's dominated Latin American politics for a long time. Countries that drift away from being U.S. client states are rejected, and then being forcibly overthrown, or having some sort of, engineered civil war, and being forced back to the fold, basically. And it's killed in Latin America. I can't tell you how many tens of thousands of people, probably hundreds of thousands of people have been killed because of the CIA. And actually, during the 70s and 80s, there were all these governments, all these dictatorships that were all U.S. backed throughout South America, and they were all engaged in this really sordid operation called Operation Condor, which was basically like intelligence sharing to like hunt down dissidents. People say, it was the socialists and things like that, but it wasn't just socialists. It was anyone that opposed the dictatorships. So, you had people pretty much from everywhere, and you could just be accused of being a leftist or a socialist. You didn't even actually have to be one. Someone just had to have a grudge against you and then go to the police, station and be like, this person's secretly a communist, I promise. And then you'd get wrapped up in this. And when they get these people, they kidnap people, or, they imprison these people. I mean, it was like torture and murder in the most like sadistic and disgusting like methods you can think of. And all of it, this whole Operation Condor, all aspects of this were first planned by the CIA and basically given to their client states in South America to execute. And a lot of these generals that did this in these military dictatorships, they were trained in the U.S. Or they were trained at the School of the Americas, which used to not be in the U.S., but now it's in Georgia and still exists. And people from Chile's military still train there today.
And some of those guys, some of the people that were active operators working with and on behalf of the CIA and in George H.W. Bush's and Ronald Reagan's administration are running the show in Trump's administration. And I'm really glad that
those are the neocons. Like the neocons under George W. Bush, almost all of them started in the Reagan and Bush senior administrations.
Yeah, or cut their teeth with Nixon, or were taught at the feet of Roy fucking Cohn.
Yeah. Who's another one of these guys that did sexual blackmail operations on behalf of the government and intelligence.
Yeah, and was like Nancy Reagan's best friend.
Yeah, he was Bill Casey's best friend, apparently. One of them.
Right.
So that's great. Yeah.
Yeah, we just found out like a week or so ago that Donald Trump got told that the Israelis were spying on us, and like absolutely nothing happened. It was like knowing that the preacher's wife just farted in church and no one would fucking touch it, And I don't. Can you shed a little bit more light to the folks watching right now about the history of Israel spying on the U.S. and selling the U.S. technology that then in turn they get all of the access to?
Yeah, sure. But really quick, I want to say something about this new spy scandal. I don't think it was to spy on Trump. A lot of people have thought that. I think it was to spy on other people at the White House that are, working for Trump below him, people that aren't going along with the agenda, specifically the Middle East agenda and this like deal of the century and other things. Trying to find people that might be, sort of have dissenting opinions from sort of the, what Trump agrees with and what Kushner agrees with and so on. So I think that's what that was really for, not necessarily to spy on Trump. But going back into the history about this goes really far back. But one thing I want to point out in connection with this spying on the White House is that we know that in the late 70s, and I think it was 1997, an Israeli tech company that was co-founded by former members of Israeli intelligence, military intelligence, created this telecommunications company that had a U.S. subsidiary. It was called Amdocs, and they got a contract with Bell Atlantic to reinstall all the telephone lines on the White House and a bunch of other government facilities in Washington, D.C. And it was later revealed that all the calls made through those phone lines were being funneled to an Amdocs facility in St. Louis, Missouri, and that there was an official there that sent all of it to Israel. And we know, yeah, and we know that the year after, Netanyahu was the first person to obtain the tapes of Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky engaged in basically phone sex, and tried to use that as leverage over Bill Clinton. And there's a lot of documentation of that having taken place in the books of not just one investigative journalist, but two, and a lot of other supporting evidence from the time, like Bill Clinton saying after Netanyahu did this, Bibi really knows how to I forget the exact term, but it's exactly what he said. But like he knows where to hit you hard, hit you where it hurts, basically.
Well, and it looks like with Israel's election right now that it may go to a third election, right? Like, or at least that's kind of the sense that it doesn't seem like they can. It doesn't seem like Gantz can form a coalition.
No, he can't. He can't. So really, the only solution is what Netanyahu offered Gantz, which is to create a unity government, have Gantz's party, Blue and White, and the Likud and their associated parties form a bloc to a ruling coalition, basically. Netanyahu offered that to Gantz. Gantz rejected it. I think what's going to happen is that Gantz is going to try and push for the prime ministership of Israel as sort of a way of getting the ruling coalition pushed through, or at least to get Netanyahu to resign and to bow out gracefully, but not be in the picture anymore, and someone else becomes the head of the Likud party. But basically, I think Netanyahu's most interested in not going to prison. He's facing 3 separate corruption investigations. If he stops being prime minister and stops being powerful, it's much more likely that he will be indicted. So I think he may try and negotiate with Gantz that he'll just bow out as long as Gantz promises not to put him in prison, basically.
Well, and Gantz has the backing of like mainstream Democrats and anti-Trump Republicans.
It's so weird because Gantz is a war criminal, just like Netanyahu. They basically believe a lot of the same stuff. And when it comes to Palestine and things like that, I mean, Gantz's position is just the same as Netanyahu's position was 5 years ago.
Yeah.
Or 6 years ago.
Yeah. And you're right. He is a war criminal. He's been sued or is currently being sued for war crimes. It's and you don't become a general of the IDF because you have a pro-peace attitude with the Palestinians.
Yeah, no, I mean, they both campaigned on who's tougher on Palestine, basically. I mean, that's what campaign is about. What Netanyahu was trying to do that was a little different was really reach out more to the religious Zionist parties and the more extremists being we're just going to annex the West Bank. But the Blue and White Party, Benny Gantz's party, has also made a plan to essentially annex most of the West Bank, Area C of the West Bank, which is 60% of it. So they're just Likud light, basically. Really not, because in any other country, I really think Likud would be considered far right, and Israel they're center right, and Blue and White is center. But in any other country, they'd be far right to center right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it amazed me that their centrist ran further to the right than Netanyahu on Palestine, and then at the last minute, Bibi comes out and he's like, "I'm gonna annex the entire Jordan Valley. I'll give it, vote for me, and I'll give you the entirety of the Jordan Valley." And I don't know if Gantz saw that and went, "That's a good idea," or if he came out and criticized it. But they're both just I mean, war criminals is the apt definition, but I don't think it completely describes the kind of scumbag that these people really are.
Well, so here's the thing. Let's go back into the history of where Likud came from for a second. So Likud is the party that its first prime minister was Menachem Begin. Before that, Menachem Begin had this party called Herut. And before that, he was leader of the Irgun, which was an internationally recognized terrorist group that massacred civilians in Deir Yassin and a bunch of other Palestinian cities and villages, and basically committed mass murder. When he became a politician, a large group of American Jews, including Albert Einstein, wrote an open letter to the New York Times saying, do not let Menachem Begin come to the United States. He is now rebranded as a politician, but they said he is a terrorist and he is a fascist. He is basically like Mussolini and he's a Nazi. They compared him to like, you know, to all that stuff. And this was right after World War II and the Holocaust and all that stuff. And these were Jews saying this about Menachem Begin. And that's the guy who is, you know, the Netanyahu is this guy's protege.
Yeah.
So that's why Israel is like that today, because the Likud party, since Menachem Begin was prime minister for the first time in the late 70s, has dominated or, you know, been a part of the ruling coalition really ever since.
Yeah, and it's been, you can watch the incredible shrinking map of Palestinian-held land in that area from, really from 48 on, but in the 90s, it just massively steps up. And that's post Camp David Accords. That's post, all of Bill Clinton's like overtures of peace is this rampant escalation by the IDF and by the Likud party, just taking land and taking land and taking land, and then Kushner's family helps facilitate that over here. Chuck Schumer's family helps facilitate that over here. There's no check on just how much influence the state of Israel has on the United States. And some days it's hard to tell who is whose client state.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, a lot of people do say like, oh, Israel is only a like an extension of U.S. empire, and I don't really find that to be the case all the time. I mean, in some cases, yeah, they serve U.S. interests, but they also do a lot of things that are against U.S. interests. As an example, you know, we all know about Trump's like war with China and Huawei and electronics and stuff like that. But Israel sells a lot of sensitive technology that the U.S. doesn't want them to sell to China, but they sell it to China anyway, and the U.S. doesn't do anything. I think, you know, some of Trump's allies in Europe would probably get sanctioned or threatened for doing that, but Israel can do it, and that's, you know, it's no problem. But, you know, the biggest example to me of, you know, showing that it's not a clear, like, you know, extension of U.S. empire would be the attack on the USS Liberty during the 1967 war. Israel knew that the ship was an American ship there near the Sinai, and they attacked it and they tried to sink it, and they even shot at the people, the sailors, as they were escaping on lifeboats. And their reasoning, their plan of these people was to sink the ship and then blame it on Egypt or another country involved in the Six-Day War, and get the U.S. to enter the Six-Day War on Israel's behalf. So they basically tried to, like, you know, false flag the fuck out of the United States. And that's not really something that a client state would do and be able to get away with, but it was actually covered up by the U.S. government to a significant degree, to the point where the sailors who like survived that attack they were under gag order for decades. They weren't able to talk about it until like the early 2000s. And this happened in 1967. But that doesn't seem like something that a client state would be able to get away with or do, or even consider doing. You know what I mean? So I think it's a much more complicated relationship than just, oh, this is an extension of U.S. empire. A lot of people like to say that, but I think it's just sort of a, you know, you have to ignore a lot of other things that have happened historically. Something else that you mentioned earlier, right, is about the extent of the spying by Israel on the United States for a really long time. And that has really resulted in the accumulation of a large amount of blackmail as well, you know, on U.S. politicians and people like that. And, you know, some people think that, you know, what Epstein was doing may have gone to Israeli intelligence back when that first started up in like the 90s. But I think it really got out of hand with the Promise software, which started in the 80s and then the 90s, and all these tech companies that have basically backdoors into sensitive U.S. government data and are able to send that, you know, and use that for their own, you know, national interests, which are often counter to U.S. interests, as an example. So the Promise software is something I talk about in part 3 of my series, and it comes off in a spin-off on my Epstein series that I have up. And basically, this was a software that was leased to the Justice Department, and it was stolen by an act of collusion between Reagan officials and Israeli intelligence. And there was a back door installed into it that, basically gave Israeli intelligence access to the databases wherever the software was installed. And it was installed in as many as 80 intelligence agencies, like around the world, a bunch of secretive U.S. laboratories. The main salesman of that was one of the guys that was the Reagan officials that really got, that got the software stolen and backdoored, who was this guy named Earl Bryan, and he had an electronics company called Hadron. But the other guy that did it was Robert Maxwell, who's Ghislaine Maxwell's father. And so these were the guys that were selling that. And the Israeli intelligence guy that oversaw all this stuff was Rafi Eitan, who was also the guy that recruited and handled Jonathan Pollard, the guy that was spying for Israel.
Yeah.
Was a naval intelligence guy. Yeah. And he was involved with a lot of other stuff throughout history, a pretty notorious guy. So that was, the first thing, and that was basically undetected for decades. So they had a backdoor in there for decades. And then after that, that company I mentioned earlier, Amdocs, came under the horizon along with another one that was then called Congress Infosys, that also did a lot of spying on U.S. government facilities in the 90s into the early 2000s. Then it rebranded as Verint, and then the NSA contracts Verint, this Israeli company founded by Israeli intelligence people, to put back doors on behalf of the NSA, put the NSA's back doors into the entire U.S. telecommunications system and popular, consumer products like smartphones and things like that.
Yeah, and
so the NSA gave a foreign company connected to foreign intelligence the job and funded by taxpayers to put back doors into all of our stuff, acting like they won't put their own back door into it or use that same back door or know how to access it. It's just like really insane that happened and no one cared, especially when it was a company that was known to spy on the U.S. It's just so nuts.
And Unit 8200, it's basically like simplistically described as Israel's NSA. And I know it's, a little bit different than that, but to kind of paint it with the broad brush, that's sort of what they do. And they have churned out, almost 30 years now of tech firms.
Yeah.
And all of these firms contract with U.S. intelligence agencies, contract with international U.S. businesses, contract with, I may not have this right, but I believe that like a handful of different people in the U.S. have contracted with Black Cube to try and get Black Cube to solve their problems. I think I remember Weinstein was one.
True.
Of them.
Harvey Weinstein contacted Black Cube. It was actually Ehud Barak, former Prime Minister of Israel, friend of Epstein, that got Harvey Weinstein in touch with Black Cube. Black Cube, until his death in 2016, the chairman of its board was Meir Dagan, the former Mossad director. I talked about this in my last report related to Epstein, which is the spinoff I mentioned earlier, is that Black Cube was the company that was, the idea for it was created by the Mossad, and the Mossad decided to spin off and create a private company where it could outsource activities that had previously been conducted in-house. And that's what Black Cube is. It's a privatized Mossad. And, the former director of the Mossad was in charge of it until he died, just a few years ago.
Yeah.
And it's just, most of its employees, even today, are Israeli intelligence or Israeli military intelligence. They have two different units. They have one that's for, people like Harvey Weinstein, people, and for corporations. And they have another side that's political, that's for governments. And they frequently, they're even described in mainstream U.S. media as being really, just an extension of Israeli foreign policy. And they tried to get all this, sexual blackmail information and financial blackmail information on people in the Obama administration that were trying to negotiate the Iran nuclear deal. That's what Black Cube basically undermine that and prevent that from happening. So, that's interesting because that totally does align with Israel's foreign policy objectives, at least during that period.
Absolutely. What was your take on the Obama administration's Iran deal? Did you have a one way or the other on that? Did you? Because there seems to be like ample criticism of it all around. And then now
it's better than no deal. It's better than no deal, and Iran was complying with it, and it kept us out of war with them, and sort of put, remember that back after 9/11, there was that plan that Wesley Clark talked about that was about taking out these 7 countries in 5 years, and Iran was the last one. There's been plans for a long time to do violent regime change, a big war with Iran. And this nuclear deal really put the brakes on that, and kept it from being, from consent being given by international governments, I guess you could say, because they were following the rules and what have you. I mean, no deal like this is perfect. I'm sure there was a lot of, corrupt dealings going on behind the scenes, because that's just how our world works, you know what I mean? But the people that wanted to tear up the Iran nuclear deal and that succeeded in doing that under Trump were people like John Bolton and people, in the, Likud party in Israel, and a bunch of, extremists that want war with Iran in the U.S., and I think that's really concerning.
I agree. Sorry, I was trying to drown out the sirens there and muted me. I have several thoughts on John Bolton's leaving the Trump administration, and one is that it's a naked ploy to pander to Trump's base, who he beat over the head for almost a year with his promises of non-interventionism and being someone who wanted to participate less all around on the global stage. I think that it is absolutely insane that Trump came out like a day or two after Bolton was fired, saying he wasn't going hard enough on Venezuela. John Bolton wasn't going hard enough on Venezuela. I don't know, why he was trying to swing his little pee-pee in that direction, but it's the exact opposite of non-interventionist Trump.
Well, so I think it has to do with this fact that there's this, what I would call a myth, that Trump is anti-war. And I think what Trump is he's anti-quagmire. He wants to do, if he okays a regime change thing, he wants it to be fast, and he wants the spoils. I don't know how many people remember, but I think it was, during the last election, he said stuff like, let's take their oil, talking about, I forget which Middle Eastern country, but, Venezuela is all about the oil. Obviously, it has the largest oil reserves in the world. The plan that was enacted by Bolton and Pompeo and all of these people involved Juan Guaido, who, still has no power, and all of those efforts to basically get him into power and get Maduro to go failed, and were a lot of them were just really farcical and absurd. That made Trump look bad. And to date, that quagmire, it's not really a quagmire because in the sense Iraq or something like that was, because there's some U.S. troops there, but it is definitely unsuccessful, and they blemish to, Trump being able to tout a foreign policy success. All he can really do is just sanction and blockade Venezuela and wait for people to, give in to Guaido, which I don't think people in Venezuela will do, because Juan Guaido is the face that, the political party the U.S. supports to rule Venezuela put out, just because they thought he would be more relatable to the Venezuelan people. The real power behind Juan Guaido is this guy named Leopoldo Lopez. Leopoldo Lopez said a few months ago that as soon as, popular will, this political party gets in power, they want the U.S. government to be a key part of the new government that they will install, which is basically saying we're going to turn Venezuela into a colony. Mm-hmm. So a lot of people in Venezuela, seeing that, were like, yeah, we don't want to be a colony because we know how that works, just because, of the past several decades and of what has gone, in terms of U.S. interventions in Latin America. So
and Lopez,
I think Trump was really unhappy with that and would have preferred send the troops in. If you can take Maduro out quickly and install this guy, do it. That wouldn't surprise me, because it would end the quagmire, and it would be in fast, out fast, and the oil's ours type of deal.
Yeah, and it would be a bragging point for centrist Democrats and Republicans alike that they got rid of a socialist. Like, if you hear these, they even threw a debate question at Bernie Sanders about Maduro, and he had to stand there on stage and tell people what a tyrant the guy was, and like this and that, and like make a distinction. Well,
Bernie's a coward. I mean, Bernie,
yes, you're absolutely right.
Like, he'll just, he won't stand up for it, even though, obviously what, mainstream media was trying to do, they're asking him that question, is try and, like, get him to be like, oh, yeah, I'm a socialist just like Maduro, and Maduro's been super vilified. I mean, he knows that if he voices support, like, that'll be the only thing that mainstream media covers, like, the next, like, month, basically. So, that's why. But, Bernie consistently just kind of folds. You put a little bit of pressure on him, the mainstream media does, and he just kind of gives and is like, oh, well, I guess, there's the same deal when Hillary, like, screwed him over. He was like, well, we have to vote. He just, fell in line. That's what Bernie does pretty much. Immediately
fell in line. And then went and did like 30 some events for Hillary Clinton, and they fucking yelled at the guy for not being green and taking a plane too much. Like, it was fucking ridiculous.
Yeah.
But it's so sad, because Bernie Sanders sat there and made a distinction between, like, brown socialism and white European socialism, and it was just fucking so demeaning to anyone with, like, half a brain listening. It's really hard to continue to support my friends that support his campaign. Flat out. Like, I don't know. They don't think he's going to get robbed again.
Well, honestly, this is my opinion. I think it's time, well before the nominee and the election takes place, that people with integrity and independent media just recognize that the next election won't change anything, and start telling people to, so much time gets spent reporting on these debates that people like Tulsi Gabbard or can't attend, basically. And that are scripted and like all this stuff. There's so much attention put on that, and the primary and all of this stuff. Honestly, they're going to rig the thing. They're going to put in someone that will probably lose to Trump, and then it'll be Trump that wins 2020. I feel like 2020 is the easiest election ever to like call.
Barring a financial collapse that happens before the election, I don't see a way that Trump doesn't win, because they're not going to let Bernie Sanders run in a general election. They're going to run some empty suit, warmonger, cherry-cheeked imperialist little but if the economy tanks and they blame it on Trump, I see a centrist getting in.
Run Elizabeth.
I'm sorry.
I think they might try Elizabeth Warren and claim that she's progressive, and she'll just get annihilated, or she'll just become a corporatist Clinton-y person like immediately.
She's been meeting with Hillary Clinton. She took almost $2 million when they were creating the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and like for the first year it was running, like in that 2 or 3 year span, she took almost $2 million, then abandoned the thing. No, she was Republican until she was almost 50 and switched because of pure political expediency. She's total windsock, and if the establishment wants her to do that, she'll do that. If they want her to do that, she'll do that. She's perfect, except for, Trump would wipe the floor with her. He would destroy that lady in a debate. It would be ugly. Right.
Joe Biden would fare even worse. So, you have the top 3 people for the nominee, and they're all going to get crushed by Trump. So honestly, I think people in independent media that just, recognize the primary is going to be rigged, and it's just going to be some other fake election. There's so much other crazy news stuff going on right now. Let's stop on the primary and the debates. This is distracting us from, real stuff going on.
I
because
couldn't agree with you more.
It's a circus, dude.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I go out of my way to make this show about anything but the fucking horse race. And like if I wind up talking about the election with a guest, it's more often than not to point out how ridiculously rigged this is. And there are, I mean, there's not a lot of people in independent media that do that. Like left media in particular is 100% about the horse race because that's where the clicks are. That's where the dollars are. That's what puts asses in seats is the horse race. And fuck that. I can't. You're absolutely right. There's too much other stuff going on to cover. I know
yeah, totally. Oh, sorry. There's a lag, I think. I'm like interrupting you.
No, go right ahead. I know you only had about an hour, so we should wind down here in a sec.
Well, I just wanted to add really quick something about Bolton. I don't think he was fired for all those people that are still hoping Trump is like anti-war or whatever. I don't think he was. He clearly was not fired for ideology and being a crazy neocon like war cock. He was fired because of a personality thing. Because Bolton's known to be really aggressive and like not back down, and to like want things to be his way. And if it's true that Trump wanted him to be more aggressive on Venezuela or something like that, and Bolton like wouldn't back down, that's actually troubling. You know what I mean? So this was about personality. This wasn't about ideology. The guy that followed Bolton, the like acting national security advisor, is also, he's basically like Bolton but like Jewish, basically. Charles Pepperman.
Yeah.
And in the 1980s, he like made this document. He like wrote this study or like article where he was like, yeah, you know, nuclear war with the Soviet Union is totally winnable. We can totally like nuke those guys and have them nuke us back, and it's like totally great. These people are nuts.
Yeah.
Okay.
It brought about the conversation of what a limited or tactical nuclear strike and a response to that would look like. I don't know if you saw the video or not. I know RT had it on Watching the Hawks for a moment. But it's this time lapse, and it shows exactly how many missiles would launch over the course of a matter of minutes, resulting in the immediate death of 91 million people. That's your limited
91 million
strike.
People dying is winnable, according to this guy that followed John Bolton. 91 million dead, winnable.
Yeah, and he's
anti-war.
He's only going to be coddled by the Secretary of Defense, who's a fucking Raytheon lobbyist and board member. The people who thought Trump was going to drain the swamp, like, if they're not kicking themselves, I would love to meet their weed guy. Like, it's just, the disconnect
it's pretty
there.
sad. Well, you know, the guy that he picked to replace Bolton, who used to be a foreign policy advisor to Mitt Romney during Mitt Romney's campaign, and all of Mitt Romney's policy advisors were neocons. One of the main ones was Dan Senor, who co-founded the Foreign Policy Initiative with Bill Kristol and Robert Kagan, Victoria Nuland's husband.
Mm-hmm.
So these are the people that, like, you know, hang out with the new national security advisor, basically. Yeah. And also, apparently, he's been described as Richard Grenell's best friend, and his appointment was praised by the head of the Zionist Organization of America, Morton Klein, who is all about war with Iran and is super close to Sheldon Adelson, Trump's #1 donor. So, and Morton Klein was the guy that got H.R. McMaster fired and Bolton put in, and now he's super happy with the new replacement. So, like I'm saying, Bolton being kicked out was not about ideology, it was about personality and methods.
Absolutely. Why that's and that's a good enough place to end on. Whitney, I can't thank you enough for coming on today. You are always wonderful. It is an informative and sometimes freakishly harrowing time. And that's good. We need that. Will you please let everyone know what you have going on and where they can find you?
Oh, well, like I said, I'm on vacation until the end of the month, so don't expect any articles.
But you're not dead.
But in October, I'm not dead now, at least. But I'll have more articles out in October. I still just write for Mint Press News. There's other people, writing why I'm not there, and the other people that I work with are awesome, so check them out. You can follow me on Twitter, _Whitney Webb. And some other, alternative social media sites in case I get deplatformed, like BitTubers, which is, sort of like Twitter and YouTube together. It's pretty cool. So
I have to look into that. I haven't looked into that at all. Well,
it's cool because you can live stream, you can put your podcasts up there, and you can upload videos like YouTube, but the format is more like Twitter, like statuses and stuff. Because a lot of people like Minds, and they Minds and Steemit were really promoted, but those are like blogs basically. You have to like write a whole bunch of stuff, and then people have to read a whole post. And I like write for a living. When I go on social media, I just want to promote what I wrote somewhere else, and I don't want to have to write 500 words plus just to publish a thing. So I like this new one. So anyone that's on there or wants to look into it, you can follow me on there, Whitney Webb. No spaces.
All right. Well, yeah, and this has been Slow News Day. If you dig the show, please hit the like, hit the subscribe button, ding the bell. You do not always get notified for this show because of the nature of the content here, which should make it all the more reason for you to watch. If you particularly like the show and you currently support independent media, you would like to add this channel to that, you can go to patreon.com/slownewsday, and you would handle it from there. Until next time, I'm Steve Poikinen, and good luck to us all.